Good morning. This is the Arlington County Board of Equalization hearing for Tuesday, July 14th, 2020. The first case on the agenda is RPC 34027-016-2711 Richmond Highway. Mr. Sean Radin is presenting for the appellant, and Mr. Radin, you can start with your 8 minutes and tell us about the property.
Great, thank you very much. Morning, everyone. So we're talking about property. It's called Airport Plaza 1, located at 2711 Jefferson Davis Highway. We've spoken about this property before. You've seen us here before to discuss it. Unfortunately, this property it struggles with the vacancy issues. It's an unusual location. There's, it's an older building, and the issue's really just been vacancy over the years. One of the things that we did here when we looked at the property again for this year, we were just going through the different I&E statements and taking a look at the vacancy issues, and we just didn't feel like the amount of credit for both the vacancy and the lease up were quite right as far as the assessment went. So we put together a model for you, looking at the last 3 years of income, and we also put together a pro forma here. This property again for this year struggled with it's over 60% vacancy, and there is one other issue, and this was addressed last year, was the issue of the cap rate and the whether it should get a metro cap rate or a non-metro. Last year, we discussed that because of the location and the difficulty in actually accessing the metro, it was about a mile, and that the board decided that the non-metro cap rate of 7.4, or for Crystal City, it's actually 7.443. In my packet, I wrote 7.4. It's actually 7.443 was appropriate. And so we're asking that be used. And this year, because of the unique situation with COVID-19, we're actually asking that an increase to the cap rate be given because of the risk of the property in the current market. I know that, that it is something that folks are considering. Some folks feel like that's an issue for next year, but we really feel like it's a 2020 issue. This property is definitely worth less than it was, last year because of the situation with COVID-19. Let me get into, well, we have a few minutes. Let me get into, and this property specifically can point to some actual tenants that have asked for rent abatements. There's 3 tenants that have asked for abatements, and it's a total of over $238,000 for the year. That's going to be missing revenue for the ownership. And so I know sometimes there's just a thought that vacancy would be an issue, or that, it's just a little bit less valuable. But this is actually some supportable evidence, and that's based on a document that I have here on page 5, where folks are asking for their rent, and and I wanted to show that to you as well. But let's look at our model on page 4. Does everyone have the paperwork that I submitted? I know that the copies that I've seen may be hard to read, or it's really small or something. So hopefully everyone has those documents, because I've got the board copy that I downloaded off the website, and it was super small. Everything was weird. So hopefully you can read this. I'm on page 4. And we looked again at the last 3 years of income, and I charted those on the right-hand side against the assessor's model on the far right, Assessor 2020. And then we built our pro forma income based on the actuals and the assessor model. So we took occupied and vacant square footage. We kept it the same at 2650. Again, you can see that model there. We used 30 for the retail, parking income, and vacancy of 25. And we came down here with a net effective income of 2.9, and then use a similar model for expenses that the county uses, 950, and we came out with an NOI of $1,715,096. And this is where the cap rate issues come in here. Again, we're using a 7.94. That's the non-metro, and then an extra 50 basis points for COVID-19. So if perhaps you were not looking at COVID-19, you could subtract that and use the 7.443. And, again, just changing the cap rate to the non-metro affects this property such that it, would be considerably less than the current assessment. So, again, I've included some concrete information from the ownership regarding folks that are asking for abatements here, that they've been granted here. That's on page 5. Some articles about the market related to COVID-19. And also, there's a cap rate study from PricewaterhouseCoopers on Northern Virginia office. That's near the end of the packet on page 27, which also shows a higher cap rate, 6.54, and that would be before adding the tax rate to it. That's essentially it. We're looking at a discount for lease up, which is very similar to the assessor's discount for lease up. And then all total, once we apply these changes, our indicated value was $14,487,604, and that's with the COVID-19, effective COVID-19, and then the non-metro cap rate. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I should have kept the clock. I think I'm close.
You still have time.
Okay. Well, then, if we did that, I just want to go then to, if you look at the assessor's model on the far right, if we were to apply to that model the 7.44, excuse me, let me if we were to apply the 7.443 to the assessor's model, that indicated value is $18,102,222. So that's the assessor's model with the NOI using the non-metro cap rate of 7.443. And you can see the decision from last year, last year's board, which was on page, I think it's page 11 of the packet, where it discussed the changing to the non-metro cap rate. Well, thank you very much for your time. Again, this is a property that has struggled for years with vacancy issues. Income is down from last year, over 200,000 from the prior year. It's it's been difficult for these folks, and I appreciate your time and going over, allowing us to speak on their behalf. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir. Mr. Peralta. Good morning.
Yes, thank you, board. Good morning. Looking at this case, we did look at the history. We did follow, not initially what the board had recommended last year, but when we looked at the most recent 2019 INE, we did make adjustments and consider that. Looking overall, the last 4 years, we did look and take in consideration when developing the test for this property. As you see, if I can compare columns D to column F, so that's the original assessment compared to what we did in our test, and in between that we have the column E, which is the most recent 2019 INE. When comparing those three columns, as you see, they're somewhat close. I think when looking at the overall gross potential for this property in the last 4 years, in the retest, we did take an approach that took all those years into consideration. We didn't change the vacancy in the test compared to the original assessment. And the expenses, we did make a slight uptick in expenses. I think we were, in hindsight, we might have been more aggressive than we should have when considering the most recent I&E, but we did look at the overall history. When we look at the cap rate, we did consider the arguments that the appellant had made, and we do concur that the cap rate is what he had suggested in his amendment today during his 8 minutes. And that was due to a combination of a non-metro cap rate and adding the bid rate for this property. Overall, when you compare last year's assessment to this year's assessment, I believe that was a board decision on the value for last year. We did make a decrease in the original 2020 assessment of about 13%. And I believe the test kind of supports that value as well. As you look on page 4 of the packet, and this is the county's summary I&E, I made a comment on the bottom there, if the board would mind looking at that and kind of looking further into it and looking at the rent roll analysis that we did compile. And that will be on page 6 of the packet. I understand the packet does, that page does say 2017, but it is in fact the 2019 most recent I&E depicted there. There is a slight difference when you compare the county's vacant square foot. I've noticed on the appellant's pro forma is slightly higher square foot vacant. The county has taken the rent roll that was submitted in 2019 I&E, and it's exactly as stated as far as the vacant square foot is concerned. I believe that's all I have for now. I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, questions from board members? Mr. Matzkin.
Well, to me, you've addressed, between the two of you, addressed all my questions to myself except for the cap rate. I want to be clear. In your test, you have the cap rate as 7.44, but on page 2 towards the bottom, is that your opinion, or this is for the department? Is that the department's opinion or the appellant that it ought to be 7.94 to accommodate the real distance from Metro?
I believe it was the appellants.
The appellants.
Yeah.
But you had said that you do want to accommodate distance from the Metro. You think a mile is too far, if it's a mile, whatever the distance is. I
believe I sided with the BOE decision from last year, that I took that into account. And
if I could, Rob, if I could jump in, I think the appellant was saying 7.94 because he was adding 50 points because of COVID.
No, it becomes 8 point something because of COVID.
Okay.
Okay, other questions?
No, so I didn't, excuse me, Mary, I didn't get the answer. The original was 7.19, then you've bumped it in the test to 7.44. Is that the accommodation for distance from Metro?
Correct.
D versus F?
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you. Want to be clear.
Okay. Any other questions from board members? No? Oh, Mr. Hoffman.
Yeah, for the appellant, I didn't see any comp sales in the submission. Are you aware, is there anything you want to bring to our attention that's sold either in Arlington or maybe just down the Route 1 corridor a little bit further out into Alexandria or Fairfax for below 140 per square foot for an office building?
No, I don't have any sales that would indicate a lower value. And this property is quite unique. Its location, age, poor historical issues and vacancy. So, you know, I don't know if it'd be if it's possible to find a comparable and make adjustments to that. So we did not go with that type of approach here. Just an increase. Thank you.
Okay, no final questions? Mr. Peralta, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Yes, thank you. Again, I believe the county did take in consideration all the points that the appellant has made. We did consider the board hearing from last year and made the adjustment in the test. Again, we dropped the assessment from last year to this year about 13%. We did make the change to the cap rate for non-metro, and just looking at the gross potential of this property and looking at the rent roll heavily, I mean, that's all the information we have. So the average rent for the property with the leases in place is what I've shown there in the comments section of the summary INE, and you see what we used in our test and accounted for even the one low tenant that is kind of an aberration based on the rest of the leases in place. And we did take that in consideration for the test. We asked the board to just confirm the original assessment. If not, the test is somewhat similar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Radin, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, we appreciate the opportunity to speak. To the fact that the rent roll indicated maybe a $30 rent, those rents were in place for some time as well, but it doesn't take into consideration any concessions or other issues, free rent, things of that nature, which will drive the effective rent down a little bit. And in looking at the assessor's worksheet, there was a comment in there where it says 2650 was used to take into consideration other concessions and things. And so we noted that when the test was done, that some of the changes were made, like the change to the cap rate, but then they increased the rent for 28 and 36 for the retail and some other things. So they kind of boosted some of the different areas and then made a couple changes with a couple issues there. So we just feel that the income that we supported here in our valuation is appropriate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it's just among board members. I would just say the appellant's argument about the 3 tenants and the rent abatement, and the COVID-19 issues, again, was not relevant to the January 1st assessment date, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot of that next year. So to me, I just kind of discounted that. My feeling is I agreed with our decision from last year that this will be non-metro. The county test, I think adjusting the cap rate to the 744 is appropriate, and I'm fine with the test. I don't know what other people feel.
I think you summed up my thoughts perfectly, so I won't add to them.
I agree.
Anybody else? Mr. Lawson.
Unmute.
One thing I noticed on the test is the square footage for below the line deductions changed. And I think you would get a lower figure. It went from 54, boy, this is hard to read, I'm sorry, 54 something, 183 square feet to 49. And so the only thought I had is to take the test and use the below the line deductions that are in the assessment instead. That's the only thought, that's the only adjustment I spotted.
The only thing, Mr. Lawson, is if you look on the top, the original assessment was using a higher square footage. And so they adjusted for that in the test and then less the 25% that came off in the center. So it does actually.
Okay.
I'm okay with the numbers. Originally, I was looking at the original assessment like Barnes, but the square footage is what threw me off. So I'm okay with the revised assessment.
All right. Well, with no further discussion, then I'm going to move to accept the county's reduced assessment. It's very slight, but especially since it affects the cap rate change, I want that to be reflected, that we would accept the 18,868,900.
Mary, I'm sorry, this will be a reduction.
Right.
Okay.
It's to the county reduced number. Yep. So it would be 18,868,900. Mr. Matzkin is a second. Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. It's unanimous. It's reduced to the county test number of 18,868,900.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you, board. Have a good day.
Thank you. Okay, the second case today is RPC 1701168, 1919 Clarendon Boulevard. Mr. Radin, you can start with your 8 minutes and tell us about the property.
Technical issues. May I just have one moment? I'm sorry.
Sure.
My computer's a little slow. Let me just get my paperwork.
Okay, Rosa, restart the clock when Mr. Radin starts speaking, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Apologize. Slight technical issue here. I apologize. Just 1 second. Okay. I think. Okay. I have the information now. Thank you. All right. Good morning again. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I do appreciate it. We're speaking about the property known as 1919 Clarendon, located at 1919 Clarendon Boulevard. Multifamily, small amount of retail here. What we did, first, this property was purchased in 2017 for $90 million, so it's about $10 million under the prior assessment. So what we did here, we looked at the last 3 years of income. Every year we found that the NOI was considerably below the current assessment. And so we put together a stabilized model, which I'm going to present to you. We also found that the cap rate was extremely low. I mean, I guess if this is being used everywhere, it's being used everywhere. But a 3.8 cap rate, I haven't seen a 3.8 cap rate in any publication. And so for your information, I've provided 5 of the leading cap rate publications, including PricewaterhouseCoopers. And these are all publications that are listed in the assessment guidelines as things that are used to develop the cap rate. So anyway, regardless, that information is there. We also made an increase to the cap rate this year for Corona-19. As you said before, I'm not going to discuss that. As you mentioned, you felt that was an issue for next year. So we're going to kind of skip that issue. But this as well is having issues with folks asking for rent for $200,000 of income is going to be lost to the ownership because of COVID-19 on the retail section. Most of them are all closed. I think only one of the tenants is open right now. So anyway, let me get into our pro forma, and I'm on page 4 of my paperwork. And what we have here is the assessor model on the right-hand side. It's extremely small. When these things get copied, I don't know exactly what happens. It gets a little crazy. So you may, if you have it digitally, it might be nice to blow it up. But I have the assessor model on the right-hand side. And then we have 3 years of income here as well. And then we have our stabilized model on the left-hand side. So the stabilized model, again, what we did was we looked at the 2020 rent roll first, and we took the full market amount times 12 to get our potential gross income there. That's 598, 5,987, excuse me, 5,986, 848. Then we looked at the last 3 years of other income and came down here with the potential gross income of 6.2. Vacancy, we again used the last 3 years at 7%. Lost to lease 5.5. Now, Chris actually pointed out to me that there was an issue with my spreadsheet where it did not calculate the loss to lease. But regardless, even so, we came down here. So the NOI is actually a little bit higher than what's indicated here on the packet. So that the actual NOI that we're asking for is less than what's displayed here. Unfortunately, the spreadsheet had an error, did not calculate that field. So what we are really looking at is an NOI of about, an NOI of about 4,099,000, and then applying the cap rate, and that value comes down to 72 million. But even with the error, we came out with 78 million, which is below the current assessment. And then looking at the retail, we also looked at 3 years income here. We used average rent for the last 3 years. You can see this is on page 5. We use the average rent for the last 3 years. We have a 3% vacancy, similar to the assessor model. Effective gross income slightly below the current assessment. And again, we applied a small bump for COVID-19. You can ignore that. So we didn't know if that was going to be an issue that folks are going to be looking at this year. So we did add 50 basis points to all our cap rates just because of the situation, especially with retail. Definitely a big loss for these folks for this year. But regardless, the indicated value still comes out below. And Chris has, in his BOE response, has charted the values for the appellant pro formas, and those are correct on the line H and also line I. So the column H's and I, those are correct. Interestingly enough, the ones with the lower cap rates on line H, those would be without COVID-19, because we made that adjustment for the BOE after we heard about the trouble that the tenants were giving the ownership here, and the issues with the lost rent and things of that nature. We made the change for the BOE. So if you look at column H of the memo that Chris has provided to the board, that is the proper pro forma for us. So and that would be without the COVID-19 adjustment. So column H. And thank you very much. I'll open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Chikas.
Good morning, board members. Good morning, Sean.
Good morning, Chris.
Essentially, what we're looking at, if we look at the apartment summary sheet as provided to the board members and the appellant, we can see that there is an increase in gross potential income in both 2018 and 2019. Effective gross also increased in 2018 and 2019. Property is still on ascendancy. It was built new, I believe, in 2013, but we can see that the vacancy and concession is stabilizing at approximately 5.2%. And in fact, the actual vacancy dropped year over year from 18 to 19. Operating expenses stabilized 18 to 19 at approximately 24.3% of EGI, and the net operating income increased year over year. With the new information received in 2019 regarding the operating year, we did make a revision. It was downward, but still projected very modest growth at all metrics to include operating expenses. And we did project NOI to increase approximately 1.5% over 19, again, given its ascendancy and stabilization that's occurring at the property. That being said, we do believe our revision should be accepted as fair and equitable at the amount listed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions from board members? No questions? No? Okay. All right, Mr. Chicas, do you have anything else to tell us?
I don't.
Okay. Mr. Radin, do you have anything else to tell us?
Well, I'll just sum up. I do appreciate the time to discuss the property. We believe the pro formas that we put together are were conservative and reflected the last 3 years of income and the history of this property. Again, please feel free to not include any information on the COVID-19. And I do want to point out the revised value that Chris mentioned was 98,066,000. Our indicated value was closer to 89 million, actually 96 for the entire property, 96,304. So it's about $2 million below the revision that the county has come up with. But again, there is a revision of 98,066,000 that they have proposed. Thank you. We just felt that the actual performance was slightly below there, so I wanted to have the opportunity to show you that information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it's just among the board members. Comments? What's everybody think? Mr. Penrod.
I'll start. I think the same as the previous case. I feel that the county did a very good job in the revised numbers. You know, if you add the loss to lease that the appellant had used in his deductions to the NOI that he has of $4,099,000, I think we're pretty close. So I'm okay with the revised.
Okay, other comments?
Yeah, I mean, nothing really jumps out at me as being off significantly enough to make a change. I mean, it's kind of on the high end of, I think, the actual value as far as being pretty close to 100%, but I think that's what the goal is, right? Is to assess these things at 100%.
The assumptions used by the county when they did make a slight substance are very reasonable given the history. I didn't see anything out of line.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, would somebody like to make a motion?
I'll move that we confirm the revised assessment of 98,066,000 even.
Do you have a second? All right, I'll second it.
Oh, go ahead.
All in favor? Aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. It's reduced to the county's recommendation of 98,066,000 even. Thank you, Mr. Radin.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care. Take care.
Is Mr. Orlov here, I believe?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. And then the other gentleman, unfortunately, something's right across your name, so I just need your name.
My name's Alex Mitchell. Good morning.
That's right.
Alex is with my firm. Alex is going to be speaking primarily on this presentation.
Okay. Okay, so the next case on the agenda is Economic Unit 1701802A, 1521 12th Street North. So, Mr. Mitchell, I assume then we'll go ahead and start with your 8 minutes and tell us about the property.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, board members, and good morning, Chris. This is the Radnor Manor Apartments. This is a small 13-unit building located at 1521 North 12th Street. It's 60 years old, and it's 3 stories. We're requesting a review of this year's assessment based on a look back at the property's most recent performance. We try to put ourselves in the shoes, of course, as you all know, of buyer as of the date of value here, and look at the property's actual financial data, use as much data as we have available to us. And so the way that we feel it's appropriate to do that is we looked at the most recent 3 years income generated by the property and the expenses incurred by the property. And we think it's important to kind of smooth out the inherent year-over-year fluctuations that are going to be seen operating an investment asset like this. And so the way we do that is we take the most recent 3 years and we average them. We think, no buyer as the data value is simply going to pull out the highest or the lowest income levels or expense levels. So for this property in particular, we looked at the actual income received, the effective gross income from calendar years 2017, 18, and 19. You'll see in our worksheet, which is also reproduced by Chris, that it's very steady income levels at this property. So 181,000 in 17, more or less the same in 18, and a bit of a drop in calendar year 19 to 171. Again, we're not going to just cherry pick that most recent number from calendar year 19. We're going to smooth that out. And so we came to a stabilized effective gross income of 177,874. We did the same thing with the operating expenses at the property, which again are very stable, all right around $100,000. So just looking at those two numbers on expenses, we're really right in line. We think the department's spot on with where they stabilized expenses. We're both right around $100,000. The main difference between our analysis and the department's here is on that income, on the EGI. The department stabilized this, assuming that the property can achieve $217,000 in effective gross income. We think that's far too aggressive based on the property's recent performance. So that's the primary difference here. We then also do take a reserves deduction above the line based on $265 a unit, and that's pulled from the PricewaterhouseCoopers quarterly study. They update this information regularly based on surveys and information from multifamily owners in different regions around the country. So that's the number for the Mid-Atlantic region for this type of asset for the most recent period. I think that was Q1 2020, that 265 a unit number was pulled from. And that gets us to a stabilized NOI of 73,484. And we capitalize that at a base rate of 5.75%. Of course, we then load it with the effective tax rate, so it's 6.776% to get to a value of $1,084,480. The department's got this valued up at $2,268,100. So fairly considerable difference between our view of how a buyer would look at this property's income earning potential and therefore its value as of the date of value. And then just to explain, you'll see behind our worksheet and our submission is where we pulled the cap rate data from, and that's from CBRE, CB Richard Ellis, the most recent period. They do those studies twice yearly. This is the most recent period, so just before the date of value. They pull information for multifamily. This is suburban multifamily for the DC region. We view this as a Class C property in the very the low end, so the best cap rate for suburban Class C properties in the DC region was 5.75. We felt like that was a reasonable place to be, a reasonable number to be capitalizing this at. The department's cap rate would be closer to probably a Class B per the CB Richard Ellis data. But again, I think the primary difference between the way we're seeing this is that income, that top level EGI number, and the income that we assume the property can achieve.
Mr. Orlov, do you have anything else to add?
I would just add that we do note that while the assessment is $2,308,000, the assessor's income capitalization is $1,835,000.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Mr. Chikas.
Good morning, Mr. Orlov. Good morning, Mr. Mitchell.
Morning.
This one is a bit unique. The board's seen it before. We do have some properties that are garden apartments, less than 20 units, that the department feels does not support the fair market value based upon its income and via the income approach. So what we actually do is we apply a per unit cost of $180,000 for one bedrooms and $148,000 per efficiencies. We did include in our packet, I believe it's page 32, that lists sales in the county over the last 3 years. We do track those obviously as they're recorded in the county. We found that there were 10 garden apartment sales amongst those since 2018. All fairly similar sized, 8 units, 16 units, 7 units. One was fairly large at 74 units, but of those 10 garden sales, there's only 2 that had a per unit value below 180,000 per unit. And there was only one other that was within 1 mile of the metro. And that one sold at 250,000 a unit. It's important to note this location, is right off Route 50. It's within 1 mile's walking distance of the Roslyn Metro, very close to DC. So as far as its, comparable sale potential, obviously we feel that the appropriate value would be placed upon it via the market approach as supported by these 10 sales. Basically, it's a bit confusing, but that's what the sheet is trying to show, is that the indicated total value would be simply by capitalizing the net operating income, and then what's called an improvement override is what gets us to that total value of $2.308 million. If you have any questions, do feel free to ask. That'll be it.
Thank you. Questions from board members?
Question.
Mr. Yates.
To the county, what was the age of these others that you used as a comp? I mean, this is whole buildings, different older type units, different configurations within it.
Yeah, almost by its nature, all the garden apartments in the county are essentially 40 or 50 years old. The one we noted that was within, again, about a mile's walking distance of the metro is built in 1959. I think it's a similar year built. In fact, it's the same as the subject property, Radnor Manor. Almost all of them are going to be 1 bedrooms or less. 1 bedrooms or efficiencies or a mix. Again, to
effective ages are the same.
Virtually, that's a lot of that is due to our sort of lacking in inspection data that we have from visiting these properties. But again, without casting aspersions on all of the garden apartments, most of them are operated the way they were purchased. They're essentially what some might call workhouse residences. So they tend to be no frills, shared laundry facilities, but no real common area amenities, original windows, original sort of condition, if you will. And again, almost all of them out of these 10 that we looked at, all of them but 2 or 20 units or less. So again, very similar in size and in makeup.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions? No? Oh, Mr. Metzgen.
Excuse me, for the department, those extending exactly what you were talking about, those sales, no, I'm sorry, the assessments for those sales, or at least the ones that are most comparable to the subject property, did you go through and do an analysis of, NOI versus market rate to see if they were off as you contend the subject property is?
I did not for the purposes of this appeal.
Because nobody appealed.
Normally, exactly. We give the second look upon a receipt of application for review.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Lawson, you had a question?
Yeah, for the county, aren't you double hitting the owner? You're doing a income approach, and then you're adding to that, if they were to sell the property for development. And I think you got to pick one or the other, don't you?
It's essentially working backwards, Mr. Lawson. It's what we do is we figure out the number of units and apply the either 180,000 per unit for 1 bedrooms or 148,000 per efficiencies. What the worksheet is just showing you is what would happen if they were combined. But the actual value is only solely derived by the market approach.
So if you go to market, what's your values that you're using?
We have 180,000 per 1 bedrooms and 148,000 per efficiencies.
And this is on existing?
That's correct. Yeah, that's for all properties, garden properties that are 20 units or less. That does not support the income approach.
But if someone were to buy this, why would they pay that much for it unless they're going to redevelop?
What we explain is that we indicate through these 10 sales is that people are buying garden apartments that are 20 units or less, and they're paying well more than 180,000 per unit.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but the income doesn't justify that in this case.
No, that's why we're using the market approach. That's essentially the point is that the income approach doesn't support the market value based on what we've seen and comparable sales throughout the county the last 3 years. And again, as we point out, is this one has a bit more particular location that would be an influencing factor in that it's off of Route 50, it's within walking distance of the metro, and it's close to the District of Columbia.
I just did a real quick calculation. I'm not even sure you can do towns. But if you were to raise this building and do townhouses, you could get 5 units approximately, depending upon how it lays out. And just figuring 200,000 a raw townhouse, you're at about $1 million. And I think, when we've looked at comp sales, we've been able to analyze the comp sales, not just accept what the department's saying. And I think if you're going to go there, you got to justify it, my opinion.
Okay, we can leave that for the board discussion. Mr. Hoffman?
Yeah, quick question for the appellant, just going through the expenses. I guess you guys noted that you agreed with the county. But the difference I see in income, a lot of it's due to this employee quarters expense that you've got on the income side. It's like 16.5, something like that. Is this an employee that manages just this property or multiple properties?
I believe it's just this property. But the owners do own the other 2 properties that we're talking about today, and they are nearby.
Okay. And then I guess for the county, how do we normally treat that? Should that be on the expense side? Is that why you have a difference in the income? I mean, can you kind of get into how, I haven't seen a lot of these where there's an employee quartered on site.
Actually, we do find that fairly common, Mr. Hoffman, and again, as noted by Mr. Orlov, it's something that's shared. It might be primarily upon the garden-style apartments, but those that generally would give employee concessions, we do recognize as a cost of business.
Okay.
Okay, final questions from board members? No? Okay, Mr. Chikas, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
As previously stated, for those properties that are garden style, 20 units or less, whereby their income does not support the market value found throughout the county, we do rely upon the market approach. Again, page 32 indicates number of sales over the last 3 years, 10 of which are garden apartments, and virtually all of them but 2 support a value of $180,000. We do believe the county should be confirmed at the value of $2,308,000. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen, if you would take a minute to wrap up the case.
Alex?
Sure. Yeah. We would just reiterate that we can appreciate the look at sales of other garden apartments, but just because a property around the corner sold for a number, it does not mean that a buyer would come in and buy this property at the similar rate if it can achieve income to justify that price. And here, even taking extremely aggressive assumptions on the income, as the department did, their income value is $1.8 million. We feel like the income supports a reduction.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. All right, it's just among the board members. Mr. Matzkin.
We've seen this before when it's where Rosie's scenario, belief in close in Northern Virginia, causes investors to pay more than what the simple numbers would indicate because of faith in the future. And I know cap rate's supposed to do that, but there's behavioral economics in there, not just microeconomics involved. So I find this approach perfectly appropriate. I've certainly worked with people professionally who do just that. So I like this approach. I'm a little concerned, like we were in the last case, that this isn't really metro accessible, but that's probably highly debatable. So I'll just make mention and just forget it, especially because it's market approach.
I think they're using the non-metro cap rate.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's overtaken by events anyway, namely it's market value anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I just wanted to throw it out there, but I'm comfortable with this. Thank you.
Okay. Other comments? Mr. Lawson?
Yeah, it seems to me that, you either go with comp sales or you go with income. You don't go with a hybrid of both. And we've had many applicants come in and say, and they're taxed based on an income approach. And they say, well, we have all these comparable sales and we don't follow those. We don't evaluate based on those. And, here we have a situation where the department is saying, well, it's worth this amount because we've looked at these other sales and we hereby conclude it's worth that amount, but we have no justification of that. And it wasn't presented that way. And so I think if, my own opinion, I think we should leave the value at $1,835,000.
Okay, I would say that we have seen similar cases to this. I mean, we've seen where the income doesn't support it and we go to, a minimum value per unit. I mean, I look at this and think for North Arlington, 12 units at, 180 and one at 148, I think this property is certainly worth the 2.308. The fact that the income doesn't support it, that's not that unusual. We see this quite a bit in some of the smaller garden, older complexes. So I'm okay with the assessment.
I follow what you're saying, but doesn't the department have to justify it? And
I think they do justify it. That's part of their guidelines. According to the appellant's numbers, they're saying that 13 units. Now, I just averaged 13 units and didn't take out for the smaller efficiency, but it's $83,000 a unit. I just don't see that in North Arlington.
Right.
So I think the county did justify it. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think 83,000 a unit would be way too low. I wouldn't agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
And Barnes, I didn't hear what your number was that you came up with. It didn't. It was it. Did you say 1,835,000? Was that last year's assessment?
That's the income approach.
Yeah, that's the income deducting the quote improvement override.
Well, I'm with Ken and Mary. I think the value is supported. It's not the first time we see this, and a lot of the buildings that we've, where the income approach did not justify, the county has done this through the years, and I'm okay with that. I think the values that are using are reasonable. It's not a mix of income and market like I think Barnes was suggesting. I think it's being, the market approach is being used, and the income is there for comparison, but I think I'm okay with it.
I am too.
Yeah, and the value from the income approach, the 1,835,000, comes out to $141 a unit, which again, I just don't see where a North Arlington one-bedroom apartment sells anywhere for $141,000. So,
I'm not saying that we shouldn't pay attention to this. I'm just saying I haven't seen evidence to justify the county's position. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, Barnes, I agree with you. Looking just to discount that income override or the improvement override and just go with the cap rate and the income approach to value it. I mean, I'm looking at the comp sales. I guess that's what you're getting at in the guidelines. There's one in Westover, but it looks like that was part of a multiple
towns, I think.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch in there. There was one that was 150,000 units. That's Westover. But there's really not a good one to point to and say this is similar, because then you're starting to get into buildings that are 180 units or, not really comparable to a 13 unit small building like this. So I don't really think we have a lot of good sales comps here to go on, and you kind of just have to lean back towards the income approach.
Mr. Yates, turn your microphone on. Still can't hear you.
There it is.
There. Turn it on one more time.
Yeah. It's technical.
You can type a message in, I think, and we can read it out.
Okay, well, we can't hear him. I guess I would just say, I mean, when I look at the guidelines that are part of the 2020 package, it clearly states garden apartment market approach containing 20 or less units where income may not support the market value is defined as following: efficiency 148, one bedroom 180. So if you do something different on this property, it's out of equalization with the other properties that are assessed this way. And again, I don't think the value supports lowering it. I mean, if it had, a $3 million value on it, I would then say, okay, I think you've got some argument. But I think at 2.3, I think it's more than supported.
Well, Mary, these are effectively all efficiency apartments in this building. I mean, I went and shopped them on the website and looked at they say they're 600 square feet, which might be a one bedroom in a new modern building, but it's basically a one bedroom bachelor shack. I mean, you can't. I wouldn't compare this to a modern one bedroom unit.
Yeah, this is Barnes, and I would also say if you're going to look at comp sales, this is in the Radnor Heights overlay district, I think, in the comp plan, and I'm not sure if townhouses are allowed in this category, but I think if you're going to look at comparable sales, you've got to look at those in Radnor Heights.
Leave me a message. Thank you.
All right. Ken, where are you?
No, I started out, I was comfortable with using the market approach. I wanted to make sure that and we do have comparables, 20 garden apartments older, under 20 units. This is assessed at the low end of those comparable sales. And obviously per the guidelines, the values of the one bedrooms, albeit small, especially for an older place, are not picked out of thin air. They're in the guidelines based on prior sales, prior years. So I'm pretty comfortable with this approach, the department's approach.
Okay, and Mary, you're?
I'm okay with it too.
All right, then I'm going to go ahead and move to confirm the county at the 2,308,000.
I'll second.
Okay, a motion and a second by Mary Hogan. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so it's 4-3. The county is confirmed at the 2,308,000. And that was with no Greg, Barnes, or Mark. Okay, everybody, it's 10:03. If you want to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back here around 10:08, and we'll resume the agenda.
Okay.
Okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, I believe everyone's back. Moving to the fourth case on the agenda, it's RPC 17032-026, 1209 Fort Myer Drive. Mr. Mitchell, you can start with your 8 minutes and tell us about your property.
Thank you. This is the Nicole Apartments. This is a 35-year-old apartment building. It's small. It's 16 units, 4 stories. And you're going to notice our approach here is we try to be very consistent. It's going to be very similar to the last case. We try to, this property is actually an interesting example of why it's important to look at more than just the most recent year's financial data and smooth out the year-over-year fluctuations in income and expenses that are inherent in owning and operating any investment asset like this over a typical market holding period. So we looked at the 3 most recent years of data that were available to us, that would have been available to a buyer as of the date of value, averaged out the effective gross income, so the actual income achieved by ownership. That came to almost to $400,000, almost right on the money. And the department's basically using almost identical EGI, so there's really no dispute there. The primary disputes here are over the stabilized operating expense levels. When we look at the prior 3 years, we feel like that data supports a slightly higher operating expense ratio than the 35% used by the department. 35% on a 35-year-old small building like this that doesn't necessarily achieve the same economies of scale, we feel like is too aggressive, and the data bears that out. We used $156,000. The department's at $140,000 in terms of absolute numbers. Again, we used above the line deduction for replacement reserves of $265 per unit based on the most recent PricewaterhouseCoopers data available. And then we have a pretty significant divergence in opinion over cap rate here. We used a base cap rate of 5.5%, which based on the most current data available prior to the data value from CBRE, that would be a Class B suburban multifamily cap rate. The base rate used by the department equates to a 4.5%, which if you compare that to the market data compiled by CBRE, that would be lower than even the lowest Class A suburban multifamily cap rate indicated. So that would be like a Class A++ apartment building based on the survey of market participants that CBRE does. So we feel like that's too aggressive. We come out to $3,672,818 based on those adjustments that we're requesting. The department's at $4,576,000, which is an increase over the prior 2 years when it was around $4.2 million. And the department's got it at $268,000 a unit for this small apartment building, which is almost a mile from Metro walking. We'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chikas.
In regards to gross potential, the property's up just about 6.6% for the year 19. Effective gross is up 1.6%. 19. Operating expenses are down almost 25%, and the net operating income is just shy of 21% increase over 19. And that's contrasted with the projections made by the county before the 2019 income and expense was known to us, in which we underprojected gross potential by about 3.7%. We underprojected the effective gross by about 4%. We overprojected operating expenses by almost 8.3% and underprojected the net operating income by about 9.5%. Those metrics being used, we do believe that the department should be confirmed at the amount of $4.576 million. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the board? No questions? Mr. Matzkin.
Based on the last thing Mr. Chikas said and comparing that, of course, being the same on page 2, there's several, under projections, over projections. How come you didn't do a test on this to see where you'd come out with these refinements based on the 2019 data?
That's to the department, sir?
Yes.
Generally speaking, when there's an under projection, a test is generally going to show that we would actually have a value that would be higher than our January 1st assessment. If it's normally in the favor of the appellant, that's when we'll do a revision if we're over, especially if it's over a 3% threshold. But given that we're under projected by, again, almost 99% in the NOI, we felt that if anything, that would go up. To Mr. Mitchell's point, we were well within the reason of 3 years averages of the property. And so we felt that if anything, again, that would probably project a upward correction, which normally speaking, the county does not recommend without the use of a third-party appraisal.
Just it's intuitively obvious there's no need. One other very quick question. Looking at this, I disposed of it. This cap rate versus the next subject property, which is the same people involved. This has a lower cap rate. Is that due to effective age 1985 versus the 1960s?
Exactly. Yeah. Normally speaking, the cap rates are within a 10-year period.
Yeah, and anticipating question for then. So I just want to be real careful. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to follow up on something Mr. Metzgen just brought up for the county. Let's, take out of this conversation column E, because you didn't have that information on the original assessment. But just looking at the 16, 17, and 18 information, it does seem like you were a little short on the expenses. I mean, granted that now once you got 19 and you're overall under, but I mean, if this was the flip side, if those 3 years were, high and then low, you wouldn't necessarily come and say, oh, well, we need to adjust it. It's a one-time thing. I mean, if you look at just stabilizing, it does seem that you're low on the expenses and a little high on the NOI. Your comments there? And again, this is before having access to the 19 numbers.
Yes.
Or the 20 numbers.
So looking at quick math on the years 16 through 18, the operating expense average was approximately 153,000. But you would also look at the fact that it actually was stabilized at almost exactly 143,000 for 2 years. Or I shouldn't be using numbers, I apologize. 36% of EGI in 16 and 38.3% of EGI in 17. So looking at it now, a 4-year average, you would actually probably tend to believe that the 2018 years was the blip in that it shot up 21%. But if you're looking at 16 through 19 now, you would say that the definitively 2018 was higher than what was achieved over a 4-year period. So I'm not sure I have a short answer for you. I apologize, ma'am, but it's essentially the idea is that if we were looking at those 3 years only, which I believe we did, rather than use a 3-year average, we believe that we would be closer, come back closer to that 36 to 38% range as a percentage of effective gross.
Right, but you chose to use 35%, not the 36 to 38. So that
is correct.
Okay, that'll save for questions. Mr. Metzgen.
Question for the appellant. You made a new pro forma and then remade it, columns F and G respectively. And you brought from F to G, you brought up your apartment income a bit from way below what you had been achieving over the last some years, 2016 to 2019, but still quite below. Why did you project that your income upon final analysis would still go down some small percentage from the prior year's achievements?
Right. So the difference between those two pro formas that we produced is just due to having more data available to us by the time we could prepare our submission to the board. So we were able to take into account the 2019 data by that point, whereas the initial one was really just looking at the 2017 and 2018 data that would have been available to the department in coming up with their assessment. So that's why you see a slight uptick based on that stronger 2019 performance, but it still is lower due to the smoothing out that we do over the wider range of years, the longer range of years.
Except that your column G, based on your best data, is still 79% less than your average over the last 2016 to 2019. So it's smoothing out, but you smoothed out below the worst year you had. So I'm not challenging you, I'm just asking you what your thought process was.
I believe that 400,000, are you referring to the 400, 750?
Yes, the column G, your best estimate.
Right, and so that's an average of 2017 through 2019.
I don't think so. It's below those. It's below the lowest of any of those 4 years. Either looking at apartment income or GPI.
2.
Yeah, I'm sure of it.
Based on the assessor's sheet, you're right, sir. We have to double check to make sure that where we calculated that.
I'm not sure I follow. 2017's EGI was 372, 2018's was 411, and 2019's was 418.
Well, I was looking at GPIs. Okay, so that's, you're looking at EGIs, I'm looking at GPIs. I didn't want to quibble about, okay.
Okay, other questions from board members?
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Chikas, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Again, just really to surmise again, the under projections made by the county virtually across the board and gross potential, effective gross, and net operating income while over projecting on the achievable operating expense based off of 2019, we do believe that the county should be confirmed at 4.576. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Mitchell, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Sure. Yeah, we readily acknowledge that the difference of opinion here is the smallest of any of our 3 cases this morning, but we do feel that in looking at the current most recent and accurate data available, that a buyer would look at as of the date of value, that an adjustment to the expense projection is warranted, and again that the cap rate is aggressive.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it's just among the board members. What's everybody think? Mr. Matzkin.
I'll say that I agree with you, Mary, during our Q&A, that the total operating expense in column D seems low based on everything else we look at, meaning averaging over 2016 and 2019. This somehow sticks out now again, especially, I wouldn't say this, but then in my last question, was drawn to the EGI versus the GPI. So that all seems consistent on both parties, appellant and department, except for that one number. So I'm picking up exactly where you left off on your question.
Yeah, I'm betwixt and between on this. I mean, normally I would look at the 16 through 18, and I think that the actual assessment is high based on that information. When I did a test, I used the appellant's number for expenses, which I think is more in line with the average of those 3 years, and I end up at 4.288 million. However, when you appeal and you bring in, 2019 numbers, it's lower, the NOI is lower than what was achieved. Yet, as I kind of mentioned to the county, if it was the flip and you had, 3 high years and 1 low year, the county would say, well, let's wait and see whether it stabilizes out at that number. So, I could go either way on this. I'm curious.
I'm right there with you, Mary. I felt the same way about the expenses, but when you see 2019, I don't know.
I mean, to be honest, I look at 2019 and think they didn't report something. It just seems
Same here.
that there's a mistake in it.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean,
maybe if we see 2020 and it ends up at that, then I'll say, wow, they've done something, you know, and other buildings should model themselves after it. But I think something's missing from the number.
So you think the 2018 is an aberration? It could easily be an aberration that we need not to include in an average and smooth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I can go with that. I agree with that.
Well, I did the same, like, you know, a lot of the previous cases, well, cases in the past, and doing an average of 4 years, it comes to 148,474 in expenses. And if we use that number, the final value that I come up with is 4,435,000. It reduces some, but it's not much of a difference.
Nor should it be.
I could live with that.
Yeah, I mean, other people, what?
Yes.
I mean, I looked at it with the appellant's pro forma numbers, since they're pretty close to where the department is, except for expenses. And then if you just use the cap rate that is per the guidelines, you get down closer to 4.2, 4,205,100. So it's a little bit lower than what Jose's got, but
Right, and I'm in between you.
Yeah, I looked at that number also, but I think it's that's really close to, I mean, 39%. I think it's just using one number instead of at least looking at several years, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Okay.
All right, Mr. Penaranda, do you want to make a motion?
Yeah, I'll move that we reduce the assessment to 4,435,200.
I'll second.
Okay, motion and a second by Mary Hogan. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. It's reduced to 4,435,200 based on averaging the expenses for the past 4 years
At 37%.
at 37%. Okay. And the last case for the day is RPC 170330007, 1220 North Pierce Street. Mr. Mitchell, you can start with your 8 minutes and tell us about Lauren Apartments.
Thank you. So yeah, we have the Lauren Apartments here, 1220 North Pierce Street. This is a 55-year-old building and a bit bigger than the two previous. This is 51 units. Again, we took the same approach. We wanted to take the most current and accurate data that we had available from the property's actual performance, not focusing or putting too much weight on any one up or down year on any of their actual income or expense levels. Actual income has been relatively steady here, and when we take an average of calendar years 17 through 19, we come out to an EGI, so effective gross income, of $873,790. For operating expenses, we come out to $425,210. We do the same $265 a unit deduction for replacement reserves to get to a stabilized NOI of $435. You'll note that the primary difference between our analysis there and the departments is at the EGI level. Expenses were relatively close, but the department stabilized it at an EGI just north or almost right at $900,000 a year. The property hasn't generated that level of actual income at any point in recent history. So that's the primary difference here. And then we also, again, have a bit of a difference on the proper capitalization rate. We use a base rate of 5.75, which we would call a Class C plus based on the market data from CBRE that we provide on the sheet after our pro forma worksheet in our submission. The department's rate equates to a 4.8% base rate, which would be the lowest rate indicated for Class A plus really suburban multifamily in the DC metro area is 4.75. So they're effectively capitalizing it with the best of the best suburban apartment assets in the DC metro for this 55-year-old building. So we feel like that was a bit too aggressive. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chikas.
Again, as Mr. Mitchell pointed out, this is fairly similar property, also shares ownership from the last case. Also similar to the last case, the property achieved higher metrics virtually across the board. In 2019, gross potential up 8.5%, effective gross just shy of 1% growth. Operating expenses, again, were down about 7%. Net operating income just up just over 9%. A bit of a flip on this one where we actually underprojected gross potential by just about 0.5%. We overprojected effective gross by just shy of 2%. But again, we also overprojected operating expenses by just shy of 3%, which led to an overprojection of the NOI by about 1.1%. And to the board's credit, I did quick math, and we're quite a bit higher than the 3-year average. And our projections for the 2020 year, about 3% higher than the average for the last 3 years. And again, even with the new information, we'd still be higher on the operating expense side. Granted, we are also a bit high in the effective gross, but that's, of course, due to the nature of stabilizing the property at the 5% that used in the guideline. Given this information, we do believe the building should be confirmed, property should be confirmed at 7.818,400. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions from board members? Mr. Lawson.
Question for the county. It's not much, but in garden apartments and in apartments in general, is a replacement reserve a proper expense?
It is. In fact, it's assumed in the cap rate that the county uses. I think that I don't know how much information we've looked into as far as a per unit or, per building, per property type, if you will. But that's been something the county has assumed in the capitalization rate for a number of years, if not since I've been in the county.
Okay, any other questions? No?
I'm looking for one. That's the vacancy in column D. And I'm struggling to get through the guidelines. I know it's page 48. I think it's a 3%. If I'm right, this is Mr. Chikas. On page 4 of the guidelines, I'm looking at vacancy concessions, garden apartments, 3%. If that's right, and you have the vacancy of 0.03 times, again, I'm on column D exclusively. It's 0.3. Oh my. Actually, 3% comes out much less than what you've provided in line 8. So you.
Yeah, they're using 5.
If I may, sir, this is actually a mid-rise.
No, okay, that's, okay, good. All right, so, I mean, just because you didn't state it in the, between columns D and E. Okay, well, then, I mean, I want to, okay, we'll leave it for comments later. Excuse me.
Any other questions? Okay, Mr. Chikas, if you take a minute to wrap up.
Absolutely. Yeah, again, based on the performance of the property in 2019, based on some of the under projections made by the county, and given that we're within just over 1% of the NOI that was achieved in 2019, we do believe that the property's assessment should be confirmed at $7,818,400. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mitchell, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Sure. Again, we're just requesting adjustment based on what we feel is a bit too aggressive of an EGI projection. When you look at the actual performance of this property, it's too aggressive to assume 900,000 based on what the fact that the property's never done that over the prior 4 years. And I was remiss before, I did not state our opinion of value is $6,420,672 based on the adjustments we've outlined. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it's just among the board members. What's everybody think?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. I thought I did the same when I looked at the EGI originally. I thought it was a little bit high. So I was trying to see if compensating with the vacancy that they have for the current year of 7% would be appropriate. And I did a test with that 7% vacancy, which comes to 66,472, which would give us an EGI of about 883, which I thought it was more in line with, what they're performing. It's about 885 what they have. And then using the expenses of 48% that the county has, I come up with an NOI of 459,227. I'm not sure how you guys feel about that.
I did the same exact thing.
Oh, you did?
It's the same exact number, and it caps out at 7,653,800.
Exactly.
I think that's more in line with where the property's performing at. And it's still an increase over last year, but it's a more modest increase.
Right.
I'm good with that.
Yeah, everybody, Mark?
I'm good.
Yes, I can do that. I do think it's a little bit of out of line, but I think that's a logical way to try to get it back a little more.
Right. Agreed. Okay, Mr. Penaranda, since you started.
It's funny how our numbers work out sometimes, but I'll go ahead and move that we reduce the assessment to $7,653,800. And that's by increasing the vacancy to 7% from the current assessment.
Okay, and I'll second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, it's unanimous. It's reduced to $7,653,800 based on the vacancy of 7%.
Thank you, board members. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you, board.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Chris.
Okay, is there any other board business from members?
No.
No? Okay, then we will adjourn. It's 10:38 and re-adjourn tomorrow, July 15th at 9 a.m. Thank you.
That was good. See you tomorrow.
Good.